Chapter 11. The Observance of the First Sunday of Lent. Blessing of the City. 1577. The fast of Lent, as it was originally observed in the Church, consisted of 6 entire weeks, or 42 days, leaving, when the Sundays were omitted, only 36, or a tithe of the whole year. To make it correspond with the number 40 consecrated by the fast of our Divine Lord, St. Gregory the Great made it commence 4 days earlier in the Roman calendar. The Church of Milan, which has always kept to the Ambrosian rite, had never changed the original practice. But in process of time the people yielded to the temptation of beginning the fast 1 day later, thus reckoning the first Sunday in the carnival time, not only eating meat, but giving themselves up to profane amusements. This abuse had even entered the sanctuary, and it had become customary to make the divine offices conform to this perverted usage by inserting therein alleluias, versicles, and antiphons of rejoicing. Thus the practice in a vicious circle reacted upon the habits of the people and seemed to sanction their misappropriation of the day to sports and pleasures. From the beginning of his episcopate, St. Charles had condemned this abuse, and had brought a great many of the people to the general communion, and the sermons and other religious exercises. But there was still a large number of worldly persons who preferred to spend the day in their own fashion. He therefore found it necessary to adopt more vigorous measures, and resolved to make the religious observance of the day a matter of ecclesiastical precept. However, before doing this, he consulted with several prudent theologians at Rome and Milan, and addressed a pastoral letter to his flock on the subject, dated March 1st, 1576. In this letter he ordered that the observance of the day should be proclaimed simultaneously with the Jubilee of the Holy Year, knowing that men's minds would thus be better inclined to the ordinance. He proved, by reference to St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, and St. Gregory, and other doctors, that this Sunday was commanded by Holy Church to be observed as the commencement of the Lenten abstinence, and that it was so observed not only in the time of St. Ambrose, but also of later archbishops of the city, citing in confirmation of this a constitution of Ottone Visconti, who was elected in the pontificate of Urban IV. He exhorted laymen affectionately to accept the ordinance in a Christian spirit, as dutiful children of the Church, and the clergy also, that their example might rouse and encourage the laity to do the same. And lastly, forbade the celebration of marriage on that day under any circumstances. The injunctions of this letter were obeyed by most persons, and when the people were humbled by the scourge of the pestilence, and ready to acknowledge their dependence on the mercy of God, a favorable time seemed to have arrived for fully carrying out its observance. This he did by publishing a general edict to the effect, and afterwards still more stringently by a synodal decree, so that at last this day was kept according to pristine observance. There still remained some who rebelled at the restriction of their pleasures, but their opposition was before long overborne by the cheerful acquiescence of the better disposed on the one hand, and by the signal chastisement which befell some of the profane worldlings on the other. To mention but one such event, a member of a noble family, having engaged in a perverse spirit to set at naught the ordinance of his pastor, sat down on that day to eat meat in defiance of the prohibition. But it so happened that without any cause to which he could ascribe his inability, he found himself unable to swallow a single morsel. Recognizing his error, and having done penance, he was remarked afterwards for his careful conformity to the precepts of the Church. The fear of contagion having now passed away, with the return of mutual intercourse in the city, there came new labors for the saint. Instead of allowing himself some relaxation, he girded himself up to undertake fresh toils. It seemed to him to be a season for working good among his people, and he would not let the opportunity slip away unimproved. While the remembrance of their deliverance was fresh in their minds, he resolved to make a general visitation of the city and diocese. He accordingly wrote a pastoral letter, dated February 2nd, 1577, to the people, announcing this intention, and calling upon them to prepare themselves for it, so that it might bring forth fruit. The following is an extract. Out of the pastoral solicitude of our office, we have at this time resolved to renew the bonds which unite us together, as if those ties and obligations were to begin this day, and as if those words of God, spoken in a like case by Jeremy the prophet, had been uttered today. Lo, I have set thee this day over the nations and over kingdoms, to root up and to pull down, and to waste and to destroy, and to build and to plant. When Judas Maccabeus, the pious captain of the Hebrew people, had mourned in sackcloth and ashes the desolation of Jerusalem and the temple, and the affliction of the priests and people, God gave him strength and courage to repair that terrible overthrow. Thus his first care was to visit the temple, and to set priests of blameless lives, zealous for the law of God, to purify, restore, and adorn it, while he deputed others to fight their enemies, who from the hills round about strove to impede the work. So now our first care shall be to visit the whole of the city and diocese, sharing our labor and solicitude with the priests, our fellow workers, sending some to look to the reparation and decoration of the material temples, the discipline of the ministry, and all things pertaining to the worship of Almighty God, commissioning others to watch over the spiritual care of the people, strengthening them with blessings and sacraments and the arms of spiritual warfare against the temptations of the enemy, as well as to correct errors and abuses, to punish the perverse and those who set stumbling blocks in the way of amendment of life, all in various ways laboring to build up and perfect in Christian discipline the souls committed to our care. For it is not only necessary to take away things that soil and stain, we have to adorn the spiritual edifice with the beauty of holiness. It will be our earnest endeavor, with the help of God, to cut off all occasions of sin, both public and private, to overthrow the dominions of the devil, to implant the love of God, of devotion, of brotherly love, and of works of piety, to purge all the people, their houses, their families, and every soul from foul offences, from the indwelling of evil and the profanation which the inordinate love of earthly things works in the soul. This purgation is the real work we have to do in order to be entirely delivered by God's mercy from the plague and to be preserved in the future from its contagion. These words suffice to show us the spirit in which the saint undertook his visitation. During its course he solemnly blessed the houses of the people, a ceremony of ancient use, to resist the invasion of the spirit of evil, to drive away pestilence and sickness, and to make them more worthy to be dwelling places of our angel guardians. He explained the value of this blessing in his pastoral, pointing out the way in which they were to prepare for it, as he had before directed heads of families to arrange for the blessing of their houses with holy water on the vigil of Christmas, according to the Ambrosian rite followed at Milan. He particularly impressed upon them the duty of removing everything which did not accord with Christian morals, and might offend the most pure eyes of Almighty God, such as profane and lascivious pictures, light and sinful books, cards, dice, masks, and all things which might be occasions of sin, furnishing their dwellings instead with holy images, with spiritual books, and all things likely to kindle devotion and the fear of God. He begged them to prepare themselves by confession and communion to receive grace from God and heavenly benediction. He printed a little book containing the psalms and prayers for this holy function and the ceremonies to be observed, giving directions to the clergy not to bless houses where there were excommunicated persons, women of bad character, usurers, and other public and notorious sinners, where public gambling or anything else was carried on contrary to Christian piety. In this way he hoped to purge the city and the diocese of profanity, and to introduce a true and perfect standard of practice. The visitation was then begun with the usual state and ceremonial. The Milanese hailed it as the signal and earnest of returning health and peace, to see their archbishop once more passing through their streets in the splendor of his office, where they had a short time before beheld him toiling painfully along in the garb of penance, borne down by the weight of their sins. They all ran to the cathedral to rejoice their eyes with the sight. Leaving the cathedral, he went on to bless every part of the archbishop's palace and the house of the canons annexed. As he proceeded to bless the houses of the laity, who had them all adorned duly to honor the ceremony, the evil one, full of malice at this manifestation of piety, moved the envy of the officers of the crown, who pronounced it an infringement of the royal jurisdiction. Finding upon consultation that the governor was inclined to support them in this view, they pressed their objection so urgently upon the cardinal that he thought it well to yield, though he could not but grieve to see a good work so soon cut short.